Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CHK Center for Bioethics 10th Anniversary Celebration Seminar Series. Seminar on what do we have in common, thinking about together about good lives for older adults. Seminar on what do we have in common, thinking together about good lives and older adults and caregivers in aging societies. Thank you all for being here today. We are honored to have esteemed speaker and experts joining us today. To begin, we have the pleasure of welcoming our Center Co-Director, Dr. Ann Lau, to deliver welcoming remarks. Dr. Lau, please.
Thank you, Joey. This is Anne. I'm the co-director of the Center for CHK Center for Bioethics, and today, together with my partner Roger, who is also the co-director of the center, we welcome every one of you to be here, including those physically present in this event, as well as over 100 registrants online. I know that there are friends coming from East Asia and also United States. Okay, so my salute to those who have such a big time difference but still manage to join us this afternoon, evening, or early morning. So thank you very much. Now, you may realize that this seminar is actually part of our 10th anniversary event. We're so glad to share that we have just passed through our 10th anniversary on the 21st of February, which we have a very rich program across. These few weeks, including we have topics about ADI. And also we have talks about prenatal diagnosis and emerging technology. We have also a seminar about global ethics, physician-assisted dying, dementia, advanced directive, and oral feeding. And today, we are so glad to have Dr. Nancy Berlinger, who shared with us a very nice topic. But before I formally introduce the topic, that's just a very brief introduction about Dr. Berlinger. Dr. Berlinger is a senior research scholar at the Hastings Center, a leading bioethics research institute where she has dedicated her career to examining the ethical, social, and policy challenges related to aging, dementia care, and caregiving in contemporary societies. Her research delved into the critical issues such as end-of-life care, housing for older adults, health disparities among migrant populations, and the moral dimensions of caregiving. So, in particular, one of the topics that I'm quite interested in with Dr. Berlinger is about her work in education. I know she leads some program, including a summer program for the undergraduate underrepresented groups. So basically, stimulating the interest of these students to bioethics, as well as the Settlers Scholar program that you lead a group of a PhD student to do research in bioethics, which also with the students coming from underrepresented groups. So I'm really amazed by the dimensions that Dr. Berlinger working on in bioethics. So today, without further ado, let's give us a big round of applause to Dr. Berlinger on the topic. What do we have in common? Thinking together about good lives for older adults and caregivers in aging societies. Dr. Berlinger, please.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Roger. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I first got to know CUHK before there even was a Center for Bioethics. It was back in 2014 when Edgar Chen invited me to come to Hong Kong to sort of think together with our colleagues here about what could be. And I was here in 2015 when you had your kickoff event, and we've had a scholarly exchange since 2017, which was halted during the pandemic, of course, but it's so wonderful to be back and to see it flourishing, to see the center flourishing, and that the exchange is continuing and even growing under Roger and Anne's leadership. So thank you so much. It's so good to be back in Hong Kong, so good to be back in Asia. So my topic today is about aging societies. What do we have in common? It may be my own aging, but as I think about doing work in bioethics, I find I'm less and less interested in the debates, in who's for this and who's against that. That has its place. But sometimes we have to get back to the foundational questions in ethics, which is how should we live and how should we live together? And sometimes together is on a planet, on a global scale. So what I invite us to do today is to think together about good lives for older adults and for their caregivers in aging societies like ours. And we have several aging societies in the room: Hong Kong, the United States, and also the United Kingdom today. So we have one of our guests and maybe some others online as well. So first, this is just a little recap when I'm speaking about population aging. This is just what I'm speaking about is population aging is the result of two long-term demographic trends: longer lives plus lower birth rates. So it's not exactly the same thing as population longevity. It's increasingly a global trend. According to the International Monetary Fund, the most formidable demographic trend facing the world is no longer rapid population growth, but population aging. Aging societies are those in which there are more people over age 65 than under age 15, with rapid growth of people age 75 above and 85 above. And these are characteristic of wealthy, technologically advanced societies in East Asia, Asia Pacific, Western Europe, and North America. But again, this is a global trend. We do not see it in every country at the same time, but it is definitely moving in that direction throughout the decades of this century. So for the past approximately 10 years, I have been directing a research portfolio at the Hastings Center that I call Bioethics for Aging Societies. What are the bioethics that our aging societies needs? What is fit for purpose for our societies? I'd done many years of work on end-of-life issues, and I found I was a little dissatisfied by the idea that everything about aging was inside dying, was inside end of life. This was conflating aging to age-associated illness. That is certainly part of aging, but it certainly isn't the whole story. So what I found was, after I'd finished a big project on that, that I wanted to do more on this phenomenon of population aging. And I'd really become interested in this through work that I was doing in Singapore at the time with colleagues at the Hastings Center and at Ethox at Oxford University. We were developing an online casebook for Singaporean society. We developed the first volume, which was a medical casebook, fairly straightforward about medical decision-making. But we kept hearing from the doctors who were our informants that it was the home context, the community context, the family context, the non-medical context that was most perplexing to them. I always remember a doctor saying, you know, the home is a black box to us. We don't really know how people live at home. This was in a hospital where on the floor, they had sketched out the blueprint of a typical house, a typical HDB flat in Singapore, because most people in Singapore live in public housing. We know how big the room is where they have things. We know there's a lift and so on, but we don't really know what happens in people's lives, who's providing the care and so on. And so we greatly expanded our informants from doctors to families. We had migrant care workers who were involved. We had people who run programs in the communities. And we created Caring for Older People in an Aging Society. None of the cases are about hospitals. They're about what goes on in families, between siblings, between father and son, between nephew and aunt, whatever it may be. And I felt it was really satisfying work to do, to immerse myself in this and to say this is part of bioethics too, because this is the real world that people who will be called patients and caregivers live in every day. And so we don't want these things to be separate from each other, but we have to help the clinicians, the physicians, the nurses, and others understand this context, but we owe it to the people in our society to share the tools of bioethics with them, because they're facing real world ethical challenges. How should we live? How should we live together? So the links are on the slides for Bioethics for Aging Societies, which will tell you all of the projects that we've done, and also for the work in Singapore on these issues. So when I think about thinking together, I think about many of my colleagues throughout the world, and I just want to introduce you to 4 of them. For the past almost 10 years, I've worked closely with Jennifer Molinsky and Kate de Medeiros on developing bioethics for aging societies. Jennifer Molinsky is a community planner and a policy expert on housing. She directs the Housing and Aging Society program at Harvard University. And I called her up one day because I'd read one of her amazing reports on housing and aging in the United States. And I said, do you ever think about the normative questions, the what should we do questions? And she said, I've been wondering when someone would call and ask me about this, because I just keep reporting on greater and greater inequality, more and more problems. But what do we do with this, And so she and I have done a number of projects together. Kate de Medeiros is a social gerontologist who is American, but she works in Canada. And she was my guide. I called a very eminent person who just won this big award and asked her to be part of a project of mine. She said, well, I'm a little busy. And I thought to say, do you work with anyone that you'd recommend? She said, well, yes, Kate de Medeiros, she's great. And so she is an expert on the lived experience of people with dementia. So she studies this as an educator, as a researcher, but she's also worked in care homes. So she understands how, when you take theory down to the practical level, what can happen to it when you're under everyday circumstances. So she's phenomenal. Emi Kyoda is a Japanese architect and environmental gerontologist. So her expertise is studying what people's lived environment, everyday physical environment is like, how that shapes their aging, their experience of life. She is currently working in Singapore on behalf of the Housing Authority and the Health Authority, kind of trying to bring them together to think about the housing in Singapore. And she's also worked in Nepal, working with elders in village communities to develop community centers that were led by the elders' own conversations with her about what they wanted, about the kinds of places they wanted, rather than her going in and designing something for them. Another colleague who's also very interested in aging and place, not aging in place, but aging and the experience of a place, is Richard Ward, who's at the University of Stirling in Scotland. He is a professor of dementia studies. He's a social scientist. He has done absolutely amazing work on how people with dementia experience the place where they lived, and how, if you bring in geographers, people who develop maps, you can develop plans that then could feed into community development on behalf of services to say, this is what this place is like if you were a person with dementia. Here's what's good about it. Here's what's not so good about it. It's really fantastic. There's an article that Kate and I wrote several years ago that we published in the Gerontologist, and it's called Bioethics and Gerontology, the Value of Thinking Together. It's very practical. It comes about from these projects that we've done, and the idea of saying, what happens when you bring normative work together with descriptive research specialties, and what do you get? And so that's why I tend to use that phrase, thinking together, a lot, because I always learn something. We have different literatures, different vocabularies. Okay, so here are some common questions across our aging societies. And these are common both in the sense of being very everyday, very typical questions, not esoteric questions. And also they're questions we have in common. What is a good life in late life? If we have trouble imagining a good life in late life, that itself is a problem, because we have so many people in late life in our society. What is a good life for a caregiver? Again, if we just imagine a caregiver as this beleaguered, overworked person, that's a little sad, because that's another person who's having their life, their one life that they're going to have. And if they're overwhelmed all of the time, we should be thinking, how do we relieve those burdens? And then a question within those is, how can research and its application focus on improving the lives of older adults and improving the lives of caregivers, not limited to improvements in health-related targets? Because when you reach a certain stage in later life, you're not necessarily going to regain all of your function, no matter how many exercises you do or how much walking or how good your nutrition is. It's not going to happen. My mother had a stroke 2 years ago, and there is a certain level she can recover to, but she cannot fully recover to where she was before a stroke. And she just keeps saying, it's a different stage. It's a changed time in terms of how I live my life. Another question is, who will care for us as we age? And what are families expected to do for their elders, whether or not we have a formal term for this? And are these expectations realistic given lower birth rates and smaller families? We can't go back in time and say, have a bigger family, or make sure you have a lot of money in your family, or somebody who doesn't have to work and can, do all these arrangements for you. You go into late life with the family you've got. Another question is, how can investments in housing and neighborhoods better accommodate the needs of older adults and their families? We tend to think about older adults as a problem of the health system. That's part of it, but I've never met an older adult who wants to live in the hospital or live in a doctor's waiting room. Absolutely not. As people age, especially over 75, over 85, more of your life is spent in or near your home because your mobility has decreased or you've stopped driving. So if you live in a place where you used to drive. So we really do need to think about what Richard Ward calls enabling the neighborhood. And that's something that Jean Wu here at CUHK thinks a lot about, is the neighborhood level, not just the whole city, but what is happening at that actual neighborhood level. And of course, how can technology meet the needs of older adults and their families? What's useful, what's not, and what don't we know yet? When we talk about AI as a solution for aging, I hear this a lot. You're thinking, this is ChatGPT, we've only known about it for 2.5 years. How is it a solution to anything happening at a population level? It's definitely going to have an effect. It's a huge social phenomenon, but we don't completely know all of the different ways it's going to affect our lives. So these are some publications from Bioethics for Aging Society that are available open access that you might want to take a look at if you're interested. Our first report from 2018 was what makes a good life in late life. It has an essay, one by Kate DiMedeiros, one by Jen Malinsky, and also one by Emi Kiyota. So those might be of interest to you around these issues. During the pandemic and slightly before that, we did a series of projects with the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies with Jennifer Malinsky and colleagues. Right before the pandemic, we did a seminar at Harvard called Aging in a Place, Planning, Design, and Spatial Justice in Aging Societies. That photo, I don't know the city, but it's from mainland China. Her collaborator, Anne Forsyth, has done quite a lot of research in mainland China and also in her native Australia on how people experience aging in the place where they live. I'm always struck by the fact that the photo could be from Chinatown in New York City. It's very familiar, setting up on the street and playing a game. It could also be in my neighborhood, which has a lot of people from the Dominican Republic. It would be a different game, but it would be men of about the same age setting up on the street. Absolutely. We also did a report during COVID when the center of health for older people became their home in a very foundational way because of quarantine. People at the highest risk were staying home. And so your neighbors, informal networks became really, really important. So what we wanted to do was capture that data. We interviewed people from a lot of different voluntary organizations to get a snapshot of what was going on, to glean ideas going forward. So that led to something that we devised. It's a conceptual tool, and it's called the Housing Lens. And here is how Jennifer was later part of a National Academies project on aging in place with dementia. And she made she featured the Housing Lens in her work. And she describes what we developed. A housing lens provides insight because it centers on the complexities of where people live. Home is perceived as a platform for well-being based on affordability, suitability, its connections to supports and services, and its potential to contain memories and bolster one's sense of self. But a housing lens also will reveal disparities such as unstable, inadequate, or unaffordable or inaccessible housing, lack of nearby caregivers, lack of community supports. Using a housing lens to focus on older adults' homes in relation to their health and well-being serves as a reminder that older adults are more than their illnesses or their clinical experiences. So this is something we use whether we're talking with policymakers or with researchers to say, you need to be very attentive to where people are living and how they're living and how sustainable their living is, not just how far away the hospital is or how good their health insurance is. And I think I have another little thing, maybe not. Oh, it comes up later, sorry. This report came out last year. This is Facing Dementia, Clarifying End-of-Life Choices and Supporting Better Lives. This is a work that is more focused on medical ethics. It looks at the decisions about when death should occur, shall we say. Not necessarily hastening death, but including that, and also including decisions about life-sustaining treatment. When a person has dementia as a primary diagnosis, so it's not cancer, it's not pulmonary disease, when it is something where a person is going to lose decision-making capacity early in the trajectory of a terminal illness, which usually isn't how bioethics has thought about things. They thought about people having capacity until fairly late. So there are a lot of answers that haven't really been settled in bioethics. So we wrote a landscape review, and one of the people who was part of the larger project, Paul Menzel, was here just very recently. But we also included several different articles about rethinking, saying maybe we need to rethink the idea of a difficult conversation when it's dementia. Because imagine if a person who knows they're going to lose capacity quite soon, maybe in the next year or two, brings up end of life and somebody says, oh, it's too soon. It's too soon. Well, it's not too soon for that person. They have to talk about those things now. You know, they may have 6 more years of life, but they won't have capacity. So you're not going to give them the same authority. Or when we talk about 6 months in the United States, we use it, well, does the person have a 6-month prognosis? Well, that is something from hospice data that was based on people with cancer. It doesn't have much clinical utility when it talks about dementia, but we use it as though it's incredibly meaningful. Will that person die in 6 months or not? And then we have an essay by 2 dementia researchers, one of whom is in a GP, and the other who's a researcher in an academic medical center, about what would make a better life for people with dementia if we improved their primary care. Very practical, very, very news you can use, shall we say. So coming very soon, in just a few months, is the next report in the series, Living with Dementia, Learning from Cultural Narratives in Aging Societies. I'm going to talk a little bit more about cultural narratives later because they're like my passion. They're the most interesting thing to talk about, I think. This report brings together bioethics and humanities scholars, lots of social scientists, and social work and nursing researchers working very closely in community-based projects that include people with dementia, and explores how the shared stories, our common knowledge about dementia, those stories that convey and preserve our ideas and values, what we assume everybody knows about a topic, shape both public understanding about dementia and shape the lives of people living with dementia and of dementia caregivers. For example, if we talk about people with dementia as having died, when what we mean is that they've lost their memory, that affects people's life because people with dementia are characteristically going to have memory loss. But if we're imagining that a person standing in front of us is dead, that is a problem, you know? And so, you know, there are many, many different examples that we might lift up. And one of the things that we do in this report is suggest the way that we could create new narratives, better narratives, or repair narratives so that they give people a better chance at a good life. So let's do some narrative analysis. How many people have heard the phrase silver tsunami applied to population aging? Very common in my country, very common, as though everybody knows what this means. And that's sort of a narrative. You don't have to explain it. Like, people know what it means. Silver, you know, white hair, and a tsunami, well, we know what that is, right? Now, and there you have this picture of all of these old people as a tidal wave, and it's a silver tsunami hazard, and underneath it is a census, like, oh no, and they're threatening these younger people on the beach that they're going to drown. Their whole lives are going to be destroyed because their grandparents are going to hit them with that walker. And I always remember Emi Kyoto in a meeting we had years ago saying, you know, I'm Japanese. People in Japan know what a tsunami is. Older people are not a tsunami. Trust me on this one. So there's something very strange about referring to human beings as something non-human, as a disaster, as a flood, as a deluge. It's dehumanizing, and we shouldn't do that in ethics, full stop, or in any other part of life. But it creates this odd situation where what we're saying is that this group of people has become an alien force that's threatening us, the people on the beach, who are the legitimate members of society, not the people who've lived in the society all these years. They're like somehow, no, they're a weird force. And the Scottish journalist James Meek did a really good job on this in the London Review of Books a few years ago, where he said, like, when we use language like bed blockers, when we say almost as though you are intentionally keeping somebody else from using something, but we're also saying like it's the older person. Older people sometimes do need to be in hospital, but the idea that we're saying it's somehow like they're wrong for doing this. We have to be aware that those are how narratives work on us. They affect our thinking. Rather than saying, well, the reason a person might be stuck in hospital is because there isn't a good place for them in the community. And it gets back to that idea of place. You can't just, again, tell a family, well, if only you'd been rich and had that extra bedroom, if only, or a person of my mother's generation, if only there were a time machine and you could go back and marry someone very wealthy. And because in the United States, it really helps you to have money. You can solve a lot of problems with that. But that is not possible. People work with the lives they've got, the families they've got, the resources they've got. So tsunami language isn't very helpful. So another one, here's a narrative, because narratives can work through images as well. How do we picture a person with dementia, and why does this matter for the lives of people with dementia? Now, often, at least in the West, if you wrote a magazine article about dementia, you might see a picture like this: a cracked mirror, a broken glass, people looking through a window, kind of, like this. But is there any reason why this gentleman or this woman might not have dementia? I mean, is there any reason why we can't imagine a person with dementia having a social life, or gardening? Is there any reason why these are, I don't know, but these could very likely be taken from dementia-friendly projects, because these are exactly the kind of projects that you describe as having a social life, being outdoors, doing things you care about with other people, maintaining social connections. But if we say, well, that's who you are because you've forgotten who you are, or you've forgotten who somebody else is, then we're not working toward any kind of a good life in this case for this person. And then here we have our gentleman again. What makes a place a good place for older adults? When we talk about a community being a good place, we often talk about to raise a family, for people like you, for people who are going to be like you. But when we think about a place for older people, where do we think about? Do we imagine a care home? Do we imagine their daughter's home? Do we have a hard time picturing it because we don't like thinking about aging at all? But thinking about that very intentionally and saying, well, how do older people use parks? How do older people use shops? How do older people use coffee shops? Gets you around to questions like, well, if the entrance to that coffee shop didn't have a step, it would be a lot easier for older people to use this, and so on. I remember when I was in Singapore, one of the doctors who was our informant said, he was speaking with a family of one of his patients who had dementia, and this gentleman was living with his daughter's family, but he used to go to the bus stop every day and get on the bus and go to his old neighborhood to go to the kopitiam, the coffee shop. And he had never had any problem. Then he would have his coffee and then he'd get back and come back to his daughter's house. And the doctor said, well, as long as they don't change the bus route, I think he's fine. That was part of his sense of his community. And Richard Ward's research found very similar points when he interviewed people systematically about where they saw their neighborhood. One woman walked to a bus stop and said, well, I get the bus there, and one stop away, I get off and I walk to my sister-in-law's house and I can visit her. It wasn't important what the bus route was or that she knew every detail of it. The bus driver probably recognized her. And various other people said things like, I don't know the names of all these people in the shops, but they see me every day. So I'm pretty confident if something happened to me, they would help me. So people's sense of their neighborhood was quite organic and quite flexible and had a lot to do with how they felt safe. It wasn't about them just staying indoors and being kept safe all the time. They wanted to be part of a community. So when I think about opportunities for thinking together about aging societies in East Asia and elsewhere, here are a couple of areas where I think we have a lot in common to think about. Family caregiving is one. There is no term equivalent to filial piety in English. It does not mean that we don't do this in my country and in other aging societies. The Confucian virtue of filial piety would be widely recognized in the United States, at least, as doing what one should do for one's parents. It might be framed as, they took care of me, so I have to take care of them. Or it's just, I've got to take my mother to the doctor today. I have to. It's the idea of like, well, of course I have to do this, There's heavy reliance, I'm speaking of the United States, on families to provide, manage, and finance care, especially in dementia care. Absolutely, you're turning to the family over and over and over again. There's also growing concern in bioethics and among clinicians that hospitals are discharging patients with care plans that heavily burden families, raising questions of informed consent as well as basic fairness. Is it fair to put this much burden on a family? But also, are we adequately informing families of what they're agreeing to do? Or are we just saying, well, we have to do this right now before 5 o'clock, before I have to make a phone call or whatever it is? Another opportunity for thinking together is about housing and neighborhood. Older adults need housing that is affordable, accessible, and a good fit for a person whose mobility may be limited. This is from research that I've conducted with Jennifer Malinsky. Cities and aging societies like Hong Kong, like my city, tend to have expensive housing. Housing outside of cities may be more affordable, but less accessible, more isolated. Research on how people with dementia experience their homes, as I mentioned, suggests how data from environmental gerontology can inform community planning, including practicalities like housing development. And again, Richard Ward's work in the volume Dementia and Place, Practices, Experiences, Connections, highly recommended, very, very readable. So this is from the work that I've been doing with my Harvard colleagues. This is from a very practical tool to help people start conversations that would build more housing for older people. We have a big problem with housing affordability, and housing affordability for older adults is inside of this problem. Older adults need housing that is affordable for people on a moderate income, which would be about 80%, 90% of older Americans are not wealthy in the United States. It needs to be accessible on one level, easy to navigate, easy to maintain, and have Wi-Fi because for telehealth and for other services. And it needs to be a good fit. It needs to be near family, walkable, near green spaces, near transport, shops, community spaces. And it needs to be near to healthcare, but that isn't the most important thing. There's also what can a person get to independently. So all of those things matter when you're thinking about housing for older people. So technology, aging, and care is another area where what we have in common is worth thinking about. There's a common idea, this is a cultural narrative in aging societies, that technology is the solution to population aging, that robots will take care of us, that smart technologies will keep us safe, and chatbots will be our friends. Many times I'm sort of confidently told, well, in Japan, don't robots take care of everybody? Like, I don't think so. No, I don't think robot technology is really there yet. But that can be one of those ideas, like in some mythical country in Northern Europe, don't they have everybody lives in a dementia village? Like, no, that's one place in the Netherlands, but good try. We do kind of oversimplify other societies and imagine they have a magical solution that our society lacks. It's crucial that technology intended for older adults or caregivers are co-designed with those users, so technologies are useful and they're easy to use. There's a lot of attention as well to empathy, to the fact that that is a human quality that is as yet hard to put into technology. You can make a chatbot very supportive and friendly, but it's not human. It's not going to do for you what another human would do. So we have to think very hard about what are the limits of using technology to replace a human experience, a human emotion, a human connection. So at that point, I will wrap the formal part of my talk and say thank you, and we can have some discussion. But thank you so much for your attention. I could keep talking, but I want to hear from you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ballinger, for your inspiring seminar. So now we'll move into discussion and Q&A session. May I invite online participants to use the Q&A features on Zoom to submit your questions? And may we begin with any question from the audience here?
Okay, thank you, Nancy, for an excellent presentation. Really dissecting aging, wider lens, and really helpful to people approaching aging. Oh, actually, aging process. I'm Albert Lee. I'm a family physician and also a public health and also in the healthcare law and ethics. And I think one thing I want to enlighten us recently, I think I'm really impressed that you talk about the neighborhood living at home. That's something the family physician, primary healthcare want people live at home, neighborhood and things like that. And we did a study in a district, I don't know, probably you're familiar, Yau Ma Tei and Wong Kok.
Yes.
Highly densely populated, aging population, high-story old building without lift, and that the street is also illegally parked by many trucks and cars and lorry, jeopardizing the walkability of elderly. We did some study, and also building a road, blocking off the accessibility of elderly to the parks and things like that. We done a report. Now, we really think we're a group of very passionate town planners. We want to make a change in advocating for change. Now, how could we do it? Which policymaker we should knock on our door, right? Housing, transport, development, I think may not be health, definitely. I don't think it's like a health jurisdiction how to plan the time. So maybe some of your past experience, if you want to make a change in the town or in the city, what would be the effective way of making advocacy and lobbying? Maybe I'd like to enlighten us further. Thank you. Thanks.
Well, this is very exciting because Yau Ma Tei is like my favorite neighborhood in Hong Kong. I was there yesterday. I just love it. I just adore that neighborhood. And there's something about it. Yes, the buildings are old. And you realize people have to walk upstairs. They don't all have lifts. But there are these wonderful parks and people use them. And yes, you do have to walk under highways, and there's a lot of construction going on. There's barriers and things like that. But there's lots of places to eat. There's places to sit. There's some of the streets have been pedestrianized. There's just, it's a friendly kind of a place. There's busy streets, but you can see how there's these other quiet areas, and there's murals that give you a sense that this is a real community. And so what you're talking about here is, again, I think it was so wonderful what you said was, it doesn't seem like a healthcare problem. It's a sense of how can people have the freedom of their neighborhood. So probably, I could see posters up like, don't feed the pigeons and, don't do this, those are public health, like, let's be healthy. But there is something to be thinking about in terms of like walkability. In the city of Boston, they do a lot of work on this, like mapping the city and saying, where can people walk freely and safely, and where can they not? And it comes in part, it has a lot to do with aging. It's not just about, safety or something like that. In Boston, they have these lovely sidewalks that are 300 years old, and the tree roots are breaking through them. So they're very uneven, and you sometimes have to go in the street because the sidewalk's impassable. It's picturesque, but it's impassable. And so I think it's called Walk Boston, is trying to equate people with that, saying, what are the neighborhoods that are walkable? And what are the neighborhoods that it's really hard for people to just get around? And so you might want to look at a group that focuses on pedestrian access or cycling or something like that. I think the idea of, if you were thinking about this like a community planner or somebody who planned parks, they're saying there should be places to sit that are shaded every so often, especially in a city where it gets very hot. And I think there's a lot of attention to that, the idea of the effects of heat and how poorer neighborhoods tend to have less shade. And so that might be it, like to say, well, if we just looked at the parks and the places to sit in a neighborhood like Yamate, I don't know Mongkok as well, what would it tell us about the experience of a person who was walking in that neighborhood? Is there always a place to sit down out of the heat? And there would be, so you'd be building it up from pieces like that. But I think also using Richard Ward's approach, and our new report coming out, he has a fantastic essay that says, age friendly is very important and it's here to stay, but it doesn't solve every problem because it may anticipate a person who's very healthy and able to use their whole city. But if you are working at the level of the neighborhood, you may, and he's thinking about people with dementia especially, you really have to focus in on that neighborhood and make that your challenge, making Yamate and Mongkok work well for people in that area. So I do think seeing Richard, if I'm channeling Richard Ward, he would say, this isn't only about groups that have to do with aging. It has to do with groups who care about that neighborhood. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if they care about playgrounds for children, safe streets, whatever it is, you say the older people are part of this neighborhood too. They're not just hidden away, they're here. And so you keep including them in those conversations. And yes, you are nudging people who are interested in other issues to care about older people and to see them. But I think that's it. And then you don't just make it, it's an older people issue. It's an all ages issue. Does that help?
Yeah.
Good.
They're not the tsunami. They're the gardens.
Yes. Yeah. The gardens and the guardians. They're the eyes on the street, the people who are there watching out.
There are two questions from the online Q&A. So, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. What do you think of the application of strengths-based intervention in the care of older people with dementia? And should different interventions be chosen for caregivers of patients with different degrees of dementia? Those are the questions.
Great questions. In our forthcoming report, this came up quite a bit, strengths-based or asset-based. There's sometimes called ABCD, assets-based community development, the idea of not starting from a deficit model. Talk about flipping a narrative when you come to dementia, because doesn't that sound like, oh, wow, you're really starting from a huge deficit? Nobody wants dementia. You don't want to sugarcoat a really tough diagnosis. But to say, what is it that people value about their lives? And how do you bring that forward so they can enjoy those things and maybe discover new things, even given their health status? So yes, I think if you look at the work of Momentia in Seattle, in the Northwestern United States, if you look at the wonderful work that's been done by Professor Alison Finney in Vancouver, based on Momentia, if you look at the work of Alter, ALTER, which is a program for dementia-friendly congregations led by Professor Fayron Epps. If you look at the work that Professor Jordan Lewis, the University of Alaska, is doing in indigenous villages, it is all about starting with the community that you are aiming to support and lift up, and not going in with your little plan, but instead saying, what is a good life to you? What is a good life as an elder? What do you think dementia means? How does it change your life? What do you think it calls upon? And then building up what that community, what is the community that can support, that can include and support this person with dementia. But it seems to me to be exactly the right approach, because it is a well-known community development approach that is very neighborhood, very specifically place-oriented. And by the same token, it helps to overcome the idea of thinking about dementia as doom, as end, but saying, no, let's ask the person with dementia what they would like to do and find out how we can help them do that. So I do think in our forthcoming report, there is, among the people I've just mentioned, Allison Finney, Mary Grace Becker in Seattle, Fayron Epps, and Jordan Lewis, I recorded a Zoom roundtable with them. And so they gave very practical examples of how they were doing this in different parts of the North American continent. Richard Ward has lots of examples from Australia and from Western Europe as well. So I'm sure there's great examples from East Asia.
There are more questions from the online.
There's one question. Hong Kong has just passed a law on advanced medical directives where individuals can document their choices of refusal of these life-sustaining treatments. So meanwhile, Hong Kong College of Physicians advocate the notion ACP before AMD. For persons with dementia, their clocks are taken in terms of mental capacity. So what are your thoughts on this? Thank you.
Oh, well, it's helpful that my thoughts on this are probably contained in our report Facing Dementia, which has there's a landscape review. Let me just go back to that slide. This one. Okay. So if you Google Facing Dementia, the Hastings Center, you're going to get this report, full text. There is a landscape review article that looks at the medical, legal, social, clinical dimensions of when a person with a primary diagnosis of dementia, not dementia secondary to something else, is considering the timing of their death. So in other words, you can't always say, oh, it's definitely going to be a decision about a ventilator or a decision about dialysis or something like that. Whether or not medical aid in dying is legal in a jurisdiction doesn't necessarily mean it's legal for people with dementia, because of the way sometimes a person might have to have capacity when they use it. So it gets quite complicated around this. And sometimes people assume things about a law that are not actually in the law. But it's good to think about this because we do have data from a lot of different jurisdictions about whether or not a person with dementia should be able to use a euthanasia or a medical aid in dying provision, but also about making sure that people with dementia have opportunities to talk about their concerns. That is one of the things that Mara Bookbinder and I, in our essay, talk about. Like, if we just say, oh, don't bring that up, or, oh, that's not legal for you, or we don't do that here, the person is trying to talk about something. They're trying to bring up something that might be very difficult for them. There is some data that shows that when physician aid in dying is legalized, it does have an effect on people's conversation. They feel they can bring it up more easily. It doesn't necessarily mean they're choosing it. So, but I think the larger point is we have to make sure that people facing dementia have opportunities to talk about what's on their minds. If people with dementia or facing dementia, a person with capacity who's still talking about these issues but doesn't have advanced dementia, is saying, I don't want to be a burden to my family, the correct answer isn't to say, oh, don't worry, you won't be. Because if you know the literature, you know that dementia does create a lot of demands on a family, does create extra costs on a family. People do worry about their children. Parents worry about their children, full stop. My mother still worries about me, and what do I know, And so we can't stop people from being a member of their family in this regard, but we can give them opportunities to say what's on their mind. So the metaphor that we propose, instead of the idea of a difficult conversation, which might be difficult for the doctor, it might not be difficult for the person. They just want to talk to you about it. Might be opening the door. Let people open the door. Let them talk about what's on their minds, and don't be afraid of what they're going to talk about. But I would also say, without knowing the particulars of the law in Hong Kong, the having an advance directive tends to have to do with medical decisions. It has to do with ventilation, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, several other categories. It itself, because we don't have a crystal ball, we don't know what exactly is going to happen when we are in these situations. It's important also to talk to your family. And if your family is having difficulty talking about these things, or thinking, oh, don't be morbid, or we shouldn't talk about death or something like that, that's a challenge. And you can't just tell people, well, be comfortable with something they're uncomfortable with. So how are we modeling that? Are we telling them it's okay to talk about these things, and it might even help their children to talk about what they want? Because again, if you're concerned about burdening your children, maybe saying, here's what I want, here's what I don't want, could actually help them out. So the document itself, that's a good thing. But we know from many decades of experience is the document alone doesn't substitute for a family who knows what their loved one would want or doesn't want. We also know in our country that some people just don't want to write things down for various reasons. They may not trust it. They may have bad experience with a contract or something like that. But so conversation with other people is very important, but it can be different under the law. Sometimes in some cases, you do have to have the documentation too. So if a person feels really strongly about something, having the document is important.
Thank you very much. Can I ask one more question? Any questions from the floor? Oh, many questions.
Excellent.
Thank you, Dr. Bellinger, for a very interesting talk. I'm Dr. Lynn Douglas. I'm a Churchill Travel Fellow from Scotland, and I'm equally as interested in the narrative question and the narratives that we're creating worldwide around how older people are perceived in things that the general public read every day, like popular newspapers, etc. I'm just interested in the research that you've done to date around the cultural narratives in aging societies, what your advice would be around how we start to change some of that.
Excellent question. This is a conversation that I think gets me out of bed every day, is thinking about these, because once you start noticing narratives, you can't unnotice them. Just in that, well, we all know that. Well, of course, aren't older people like, whatever it may be, and it's based on what exactly? Older people are very diverse in their experiences. They have they are in many different ways, but also aging, our concept of aging might cover people who are in their 60s and very active, and it covers people who are 100 years old. That's a very long period of time. We don't talk about people who are newborn and people who are 35 as though they are having the same experience, but we do that in aging. And so it is really important to think about the caregiver who might be an older person and the person they're caring for who's a much older person are having these different experiences. So I have found that I'm especially attentive these days, because my mother's 90, because I'm a caregiver, and I bet some of you have had some of these experiences, is I'm very attentive to how people talk about caregivers. When people start saying, oh, caregivers are so overwhelmed. Oh, overwhelmed. These poor people are so overwhelmed and they need a support group. They're so overwhelmed. I'm like, A, I do not have time to go to a support group. And B, I don't like the feeling of being overwhelmed, and I certainly can't show being overwhelmed to my mother. That would be, to me, it would be disrespectful. I have to be very smooth and friendly and, toward my mother. I might feel on some days like, oh my gosh, there's all of these things I have to do on this list. But I think we have to think about how we imagine what a person is doing and saying, this is a hard job. And you you don't, it's not quite like being a parent where you absolutely know you've got this baby. You definitely have to take care of this baby. That's a thing, you know? And so, whereas research from the AARP, which is a major organization that advocates on behalf of older people in the United States, presented research that showed that people who care for older adults often can't identify themselves as caregivers because they think of it as we have to be doing everything for someone for it to count. But it's like, well, sometimes you're taking someone to the doctor, and sometimes you're doing their grocery shopping, and sometimes you're sorting out something at the pharmacy, and sometimes you're paying a bill, and sometimes you're doing all of these things in like one day, you know, and or you're just having a chat on the phone as well. And you're saying, but all that counts, you know? And they're saying, you know, if people can't identify themselves as a caregiver, it's really hard to think of them as a group, as a population. I find that, so I find I'm very always questioning how people present what I'm doing, you know, that, you know, I'm sort of, sort of doing a critical narrative all the time. And also about the way we talk about older adults as, for example, activities. Well, do any of you have hobbies or pastimes? Do you call them activities? No, we don't. We only use that term for older people. They have activities, you know, but these could be deeply meaningful pursuits. You know, in some cases, things they've done their whole lives. And in some cases, in my mother's case, it was only after she had a stroke and had to stop doing a lot of other things that she discovered what her passion is, which is painting. She'd wanted to paint for 30 years. I know that because I cleaned out her apartment and I found all the books about painting, all the sets of paint and all the canvases that she'd bought, but she never had time. But she does it now. You know, so she's like, who knew I was going to be a creative person at age 90. But so I think that's one thing we have found from all sorts of research, including there's a wonderful piece in our new report by Canadian researcher Julia Henderson on creativity in late life, creativity in dementia, and how art therapy is not the same thing as making art. And do we give people opportunities to make art, to learn something new in a supportive, friendly, non-judgmental way, often a collective kind of a project, rather than just imagining it has to have a therapeutic use, you know, or that with health metrics attached to it. Because as people will say, it's never going to restore a person's memory. It's not going to restore function. Dementia is progressive. So it's not going to capture that cost savings. But is it going to make someone's life better? Yes. Is it going to give them choice into a life that's where they're losing opportunities to make choices? Yes, you know, and that would apply if a person didn't have dementia as well. So I think that's part of it. That's part of what we're learning are just some of these ways that can give life more zest. You know, we have to think about making people's lives better, we have to make sure that our language isn't limiting them and diminishing them and saying, well, you're only interested in some things. That could be our own fears projected onto later life, saying, oh, my life is just going to be playing bingo or playing mahjong or whatever game we think old people play.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question, which I'm curious if your research has covered any of this. So in general, we hear a lot about preparedness in like disaster response or pandemic preparedness. Is there any research you've done on aging preparedness? And I speak of that because my mom's in her 60s. I think she's super young, she's super fit, but I specifically got her to start doing weight resistance exercises. Not because she needs it now, but because when she's 80, I want her to be able to be mobile and walk around and do her own, you know, travel, do whatever she wants to do. So I'm curious how much of that is within like your research and what can we do about preparedness for aging?
Well, I applaud you on that because that is great. And my mother would applaud you on that. My mother is very use it or lose it. And she has been saying to me, you know, you have to keep working on your balance. You have to keep working on your posture. And there is certainly research that shows, we can't turn off cellular senescence. What happens to our cells as we age and they become less resilient? But strength training, balance, any of those things, that my yoga teacher is saying, motion is lotion, just keep using it. And it is also good for your mental health and so on. So, there's, and you can keep adapting movement for people. There's a dance approach that works for people with Parkinson's symptoms who have difficulty picking their feet up and difficulty with balance. So there's always something that can be done. But in terms of strength training, because you lose muscle mass as you age, it's a very good idea to try to add muscle while you still can and to work on balance while you still can. Just ask any older person. Balance is so important. I go to a gym, I do strength training, and my trainer is in her 60s. And she works with lots of older people, and I might be working out one day with somebody who's 70 and somebody who's 25 in the same class. But it's funny. It's one of the places where I bond with other caregivers, because a lot of women, is on the same age. We sort of look at each other and say, so how are you doing? How's your dad? You don't know anything else about the person other than you lift weights together and you have this parental experience in common. But it means we're very safe to talk to each other. And if you can't talk to a person in person, you text them and you just say, oh, can you help me with this? Do you know how this is going? And it creates this little, very organic kind of very practical support group. I think that's really useful. So whenever I get a call from a reporter to talk about something like this, I'll check with some of my real world contacts. It's not formal research, but it's, I'll be citing research studies, but I'll say, how is it with you when this happens? And then you get some real world feeling into it. But I do think that is very important to make sure that people do it, but they also have the means to do it. Because if you just say, you have to work out, well, how? Where is the gym? Can you get to it? How much does it cost? Will you feel comfortable there? There's a lot of steps before somebody ever walks in that door. I remember in Singapore, there were these sort of dedicated gyms for older people in the housing estates, and anybody could use them. It was great, but you could also have PT there. And I thought, well, that seemed really good. And I remember telling my mother, she said, that would be great for a dementia caregiver, because you just take the lift down and there it is. You don't have to get in a car. And so that is important to make sure that these ideal, optimal places are near where people are.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ballinger, and everyone for an engaging discussion. As we came to the end of today's seminar, may I invite Professor Roger Cho, our Center Co-Director, to give us a welcoming, the closing remarks.
Well, can we give another round of applause for Dr. Nancy Ballinger?
Thank you.
And I think we have a gift for you.
Oh,
yeah, it's photo
gift.
time.
Oh.
So, Anne, why don't we present this? This is
Would you like
actually
it?
the
The library.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to need to pay a baggage allowance, but it's in a good cause.
Let's take a picture.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
This is wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody, and also the audience and online. So as we're closing, I would just like to just show two very quick slides about our center, as we are actually celebrating the 10th anniversary this year in 2025.
Oh, wow.
Our mission remains staunch to identify, explore, and share ethical challenges in health and healthcare in Asia and Hong Kong and worldwide. We try to engage more societal awareness of bioethics through three things mainly: education, research, and also community engagement, so that we can facilitate a dialogue and also a dialogue between East and West. So a lot of things that Nancy, you have talked about today is not East versus West. It is East and West, and how do we engage them? And there's always something that we can learn from the West, and I believe there's always something that you can learn from us. So I think we should do this more often. And I think Hong Kong is really having this geographic advantages and also cultural diversity to do this. So we strive to significantly contribute to the development of bioethics in Asia, which is much needed. And so we have some topical pillars: bioethics education, end-of-life care, genetics, genomics, AI, emerging technologies, and also culture and humanities, which I think really put everything into perspectives. So through education, research, and public engagement. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. And we will have more upcoming events. So please make sure that you pay attention to our website. You can add us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and also Instagram. So thank you very much. And thank you for all the staff who helped out to make our center, a great one. Thank you very much.